We've been studying our way through the book of Hebrews, and we find ourselves in chapter 11 and verse 32, where we've kind of slowed down a little bit, and unlike the writer of Hebrews, we're taking a little more time to get through this one verse. And he was saying that time did not allow him. He was pressed for time. He needed to get this letter done and get it out so that he could encourage those people who were facing persecution. And the Hebrew people that he was writing to were already being, they were being rejected by their family, by their culture, by their neighborhood. Their businesses were being slowed, and they were being accused, actually, of bringing pain from Rome to their nation, to their community. And so the writer of Hebrews wrote to encourage them to stay the course, to stay focused on Jesus. And the book of Hebrews is really two bigger parts. The first part goes through chapter 10, and that has to do with the supremacy of Christ. It has to do with his salvation, that as the Son of God, he offered for us, he offered for you a perfect sacrifice. And he took your sin and nailed it to the cross, so that when we place our trust in him, we are saved. That offering has been made. It has been made in heaven. It is secure, and there's nothing we can do to add or take away from that. On the other hand, he begins to transition in chapter 10 to living by faith. And so what does that mean? And you'd like to have this little definition. Well, live by faith is da 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 da. But it's a little bigger than that. It's a little harder to understand, and it's because we're such individuals that we are in different places and experience different things and struggle in different ways. That is a difficult definition to envelop everybody. And so we've been looking at some of the lives that he's brought up as ways of encouraging, as ways of strengthening, of ways of helping us to understand that our walk with God involves walking by faith. And it's as we walk by faith, we grow. If we don't walk by faith, we stagnate. We just stay right where we are. But a step of faith usually means a step up. It means to take a difficult step. And so walking by faith means that we grow in these little areas. And so when bigger challenges come our way, we can say, okay, that's the natural thing to do, is trust God in this. It's not a natural thing if we're not walking by faith. And so we've been looking at some of these people, and we've looked at some of the heroes, some of the great names of faith. And then we got into some names in verse 30, 31. You have Rahab the harlot. You have in 32, we've already looked at names like Gideon. Remember Gideon? He was the scaredy cat hiding out underneath the wine press, trying to winnow wheat under the wine press and hide it away. And the angel of the Lord came and said, "Come on." And he was still scared. He still had to have all kinds of assurances, because I'm the least of the least, the least of the least. You don't need me. But the Lord had called him. And so he went, and we saw some of the things that he did. We looked at Barak, and how he was unwilling to serve as a ruler, but he would lead the army, and Deborah would go with him. Remember that guy? And but because of the way he refused to take the reins, to step up and fill the gap, to walk by faith with God, that God said, you won't have any honor in this. And then there's Samson. We looked at Samson. And that's really a sad story, but he's included here in this list. And we think, why him? He was, the Holy Spirit would come on him. He was a judge in Israel for 20 years. writer of Hebrews is giving to us something here that we can hang on to, that we can be challenged by. And that is that we need to be careful. There's a doctrine that's going through Christianity and has for quite a while. It's the prosperity gospel. It's the health and wealth gospel. It's if you just have enough faith, anything you're facing will be conquered. And if you're struggling today, and if you're the oppression has come and is visiting, and we can't get better, or the prognosis is really bad, or things just seem to happen that are bad, and we say, well, you just don't have enough faith. If you really trusted God, things would go better, and you would be successful and healthy and wise, and you don't find that anywhere in the Bible. That's a lie. And so I think the writer of Hebrews is saying, look, Christians who are struggling, Christians who are facing persecution, Christians who are being accused and rejected, listen, walk by faith. Walk by faith. That God is with us, whether it's sunny or whether we're being rained on. Whether we're running and hiding, or whether we're being challenged in ways that we never thought we could ever face, walk with God. Walk with God. Because that's the way the Bible is laid out. That's what we're given. These aren't perfect people. They're not perfect in faith. But they did walk with God. And for that they were lifted up. The next name we have is Jephthah. And so if you want to take and turn back to Judges, in Judges chapter 11, we have Jephthah. Who is Jephthah? There's some of these other names we know pretty well, but Jephthah, not the dynasty guy, but Jephthah the judge. Jephthah the person here in the Hall of Fame of Faith. Who is this guy? And he's found in chapter 11. Actually, the story starts in chapter 10, partway through, and it's where God is dealing with the Israelites, and they are involved in this cycle of apostasy, or a cycle of sin, and they start walking with God, and then they turn away from God and start following all kinds of idols, and then God says, I've had enough, I'm going to take my protection away, and oppression is going to come, and other nations rise up against them and begin to raid their crops and challenge them and just make their lives miserable. And then they finally call out to God, and at that point, God will raise up a judge in answer of their prayer and deliver them from their oppression, and then there's peace for a while. And then it starts again. Well, in the book of Judges, you have several different judges or rulers that are raised up, or saviors, deliverers, who come and who help them and who deliver them. And Samson was one, Barak was one, Deborah was one. There's several of the names that we've heard and talked about in our studies, but Jephthah is one. And Jephthah was actually reigned for a pretty short time, about 6 years. But Jephthah came from a little different stock, in a little different way. And the Ammonites were attacking Israel. Israel had fallen into worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth. That seemed to be one of their big areas of tripping up. And God said in chapter 10, okay, I'm going to let the Ammonites come in and raid and make your lives miserable. You need to get rid of these gods. If you want their protection, let them protect you. Well, that didn't work so well, and their lives were miserable, and the Ammonites really picked their game up for about a year. And people started to call out to God again and say, look, we need your help. We need you to save us. We need you to rescue us. And so God says, well, what's wrong with Baal and Ashtaroth? They're the ones you've been worshiping. And They said, oh, they're not working so well. We'll get rid of them. We're going to focus on you, the true and living God. And God says, well, okay, then I'll raise up a judge or a ruler, a leader to help you. And that's when we get to chapter 11. In chapter 11, verse 1, we read, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. Now, that says a lot right there. Jephthah the Gileadite, it means his father was named Gilead. And so as he had a son named Jephthah, he became a mighty warrior. Okay, that didn't happen overnight. Okay, there's a lot of things that happened in Jephthah's life that made him a mighty warrior. And that's what this story is about. Okay, he says, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Well, the people of Israel who were really concerned about being a blue blood, okay, they had to come from the right stuff, the right stock. And in order to do anything in Israel, to be a leader, to be a prophet, to be a teacher of any kind, you had to have this pure blood. And so in verse 2 it says, Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And they were grown up, and they drove Jephthah away. You're not going to get any inheritance in our family, they said, because you are the son of another woman. And Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a group of adventurers, or some say worthless fellows, worthless people, gathered around to follow him. So here we have this guy Jephthah. Jephthah was the product of a relationship his father had with a prostitute. Apparently his mother either didn't want him or couldn't take care of him because his father went and got him and brought him and raised him in his home. Well, as they grew up, I can't imagine the torment he must have faced from his brothers, his half-brothers. But as he lived in the home, and as they grew, and they picked on him and tormented him and just rejected him, and it got so bad that Jephthah finally said, I've had enough. I'm leaving. And so he left. And he went into the hill country to Tob. And Tob is up in the mountains, a place where a lot of us dream of living. And there he settled. There he pitched his tent. And there he began to raid. Okay, and as he began to raid, his skills improved. And people started to follow him. And people who were like him, who were rejected from their families. Remember, Israel was a group of families. They were Israelites, but they all came from different tribes. And so they were rejected people. And they would go up into the mountains and do whatever they could do. They weren't going to inherit any property. They weren't going to inherit the land like all the other Israelites. So they had to find a way for themselves. And this is what Jephthah did. But he improved his leadership skills and his ability to fight. He's Jephthah, the guy you want in a fight. You want him on your side. You want, in fact, I've got your back, Jephthah. I'm here if you need me. Please don't need me. But Jephthah was the guy. He was the guy that, he kicked the door down and come in with his pitchfork ready. I mean, he was ready to tangle. He was a tough guy. He was a tough guy. But he was there because he was rejected. He was there because his mother didn't want him, his brothers didn't want him, and the elders of their community, of the Gileadites, didn't want him. And so he left and went up in the mountains. Verse 4. Sometime later, the Ammonites were descendants of Ammon. They were on the, basically, earlier had property east side of the Jordan. Okay, Israel's on the left side, some on the east side after they resettled the land. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. But they were on the east side of the Jordan, and they were the ones who were tormenting Israel. And they would come in, they'd take their flocks, they would take their crops, they would take anytime Israel would have a little bit of success in doing anything, growing, planting, harvesting, the Ammonites would come in and take it. They just made life miserable. And so they were really oppressing Israel at this point, especially the Gileadites. And it says, so sometime, in verse 4, it says, sometime later, the Ammonites made war on Israel. The elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob, or Tob, or however you want to say that. They went to get him. Well, why would you want Jephthah? He's this rebel. He's this reject that you pushed away. Why would you want him? Well, it tells us why they wanted him. Verse 6, it says, come, they said, be our commander, so we can fight the Ammonites. Well, what's the matter, brothers? You seem to be good at fighting when I was growing up. You seem to be good at tormenting me. Why can't you take those skills and use them on the Ammonites? See, they didn't grow up tough. They grew up entitled. They grew up pampered. They grew up in the security of knowing that they were always welcome at their father's table. Jephthah didn't have that. Jephthah learned to fight. Jephthah learned to be tough. Jephthah learned to be resourceful. And because he did that, he became a valuable resource when the Ammonites needed to be confronted. Okay, he had the right skills. Verse 7, Jephthah said to them, well, certainly I'll come and bail you out. No, he didn't. He said this. I kind of like Jephthah here. Jephthah said to them, don't you hate me? Now wait a minute. You hated me, you drove me away, and now you want me back? What happened? I didn't shower. What happened? You know, what's going on? He says, why come to me now? Why come to me when you're in trouble? Verse 8. And the elders, anytime you see elders, it means gray hair. It's the older guys that don't want to fight. It's the older guys that want to pick the young guys and say, you guys do it. Well, you know, you're great, go get them. And the elders of Gilead said to him, nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head over all who live in Gilead. You'll be our ruler. You'll be our judge. So if you come and fight for us, we'll give you that place of honor, that seat of importance. You'll be the head guy. When decisions are to be made, we'll come to you for that. We'll say, whatever you say goes. Of course, Jephthah trusted him completely. In verse 9, he answered, he says, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? Doesn't sound like a trusting guy. Sound like a guy that maybe had his hand slapped a few too many times. Maybe got told you get to the back of the line, you're not leading us. You're not going to be our judge. You're not going to be our ruler. You're not going to be our leader. In fact, you're not even going to sit at the table. You're out of here. And so Jephthah was saying, how is this going to happen? So he said, we'll make it happen. We'll get together with the group from verse 9, or verse 10, 11. We'll make this all work. We'll get you what you need. We'll get it signed. We'll get a shake on it. It'll be a deal. We can't go back on it. Okay? In verse 12, Jephthah agrees. are you fighting? What did we ever do to you? And he says, what do you have against us? Why are you attacking? Why are you endangering your people and our people? What's going on? What do you think? And the king of the Ammonites, verse 13, answers Jephthah's messengers. When Israel, they didn't have texting back then. They probably just sent a text or got on Facebook. They didn't have that back then. They sent messengers. It says, when Israel came up out of the land of Egypt, they took away my land from Aaron to Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peaceably. So the king of the Ammonites says, look, you took my land. And because you took my land, I want it back. And I don't want to have to fight for it. If you want us to leave you alone, just give us our land and move out. And what's he talking about? Well, apparently, he doesn't really know, because Jephthah answered him and said, look, buddy, you weren't there. It's not your land. You weren't there. This was 300 years ago. 300 years earlier, and he explains this. This is most of the next column and a half in your Bible. He explains what took place. When Israel was in Egypt as slaves, and God freed them after the Passover, and they left and they followed Moses out of Egypt. They went out across the Red Sea, and the armies of Egypt drowned, and then they started up, and they went to Sinai, and from Sinai, they took the east side, remember the east side of the Jordan, the Dead Sea, and they made their way up that east side. And every time they would come to the border of another country, they would stop, and they would camp, and they would send messengers. They'd send messengers to the leader, to the king, to whoever was the ruler, and they would say, we want to cross your land. I know we're a big group. We just want to cross it. We won't pick any of your crops. We will pick up our trash. We just want to cross your land. We're not going to cause you any trouble. You just let us cross. And nation by nation, they would say, okay, you can cross. And they'd get to the next one. And then they would say we could cross. Well, they got to the land of Ammon, the Ammonites. And all they had to do is go up through there and make a left across the Jordan. They were in Israel. Okay? It was just a real short deal. Barely caught the edge of their land. And so they went up to the end of the edge, the border of Ammon, and sent messengers in and said, hey, we want to cross your land. We're not going to cause any problems. We're not going to eat any of your food. We're not going to pick any of your crops. We just want to go across. God is providing for us. He's providing manna. Our shoes don't even wear out. We don't have to take a thing from you or your land. Just let us cross. Well, the king of Ammon, this 300-year-old king, I think his name is answered with this. He came down, he got all his people together, all his mighty men, all his people that could fight, and he came down to the border to fight against Israel. That was his answer. Because we're just going to whoop you. And God said, oh no, you're not going to do that. And he rose up Israel against them, and they defeated the Ammonites, chased them off their land, and God said, just for that, I'm giving this land to the Israelites. And so the Ammonite land wasn't really the Ammonites, it's God's, but God gave that part of the eastern side of the Jordan to the Israelites. By the way, they're still fighting over that piece of land 3,000 years later. But he said, God gave it to the Israelites. And so we possess the land. Okay? 300 years later, they're in the land, they cross the Jordan, they are settling the land, they're warring with the different Canaanite tribes and getting them off the land like God told them to do. And so now we're years later, the Ammonite king now is saying, oh, I'm feeling tough because when I raid, I can take all your stuff and you need to listen to me and I want my land back. And I love what Jephthah says. Jephthah, in verse 23, he says, now since the Lord God of Israel has driven the Amorites out before us, out before his people of Israel, what right have you to take it over? He says, look, God whooped you once and took away your land because you weren't nice. You didn't play well. And so God took your land and gave it to us. Your fight is with him. Your battle is with God. The true and living God of Israel, that's who you're battling. And then he says this. Don't you like Jephthah? He says, will you not take what your God Chemosh gives you? He says, let me rephrase that. Why don't you go talk to your little idol and see what land he gives you? And maybe he'll give you a nice piece of property that you can live on. Why don't you go take that to him? Because our God gave us this land. And you can't have it back. Well, you can't imagine how the king of the Amorites reacted to that. Actually, it says he wouldn't listen to it. Verse 26. 28 says the king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message of Jephthah's son. And so in verse 29 it says the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. And he started towards battle. He started to lead that group against the Amorites. And on his way, and I don't know whether it was adrenaline, I don't know if he was just trying to get a step up, but he said, Lord, I'm going to make you this vow. I vow that if you give us this victory, whoever walks out of the door of my house, my tent, when I get back, I'll sacrifice to you. I'll give to you like a burnt offering. A burnt offering, so we can keep this in mind, a burnt offering was to be a young bull. A young bull was a way of saying, God, I just thank you. I love you for what you've done, and I'm going to give you this offering. And they were to roast this bull on an altar. And the idea was is that you ever go out and you smell the neighbor's barbecue, steak, hamburgers, whatever, and you go out and go, honey, watch them. When they go in the house, I got a little mission. I'm going to go snitch something. No, we don't do that. Scratch it. I never said that. But you go out and smell that. And the idea is that this amazing aroma is going up to God. That's the idea of a burnt offering. Okay, so he says, I'm going to offer you as a burnt offering whatever comes out. Now, I think he had in mind a couple of things. I think maybe he had, we've got this little bowl that every time I come around, he nails me. He sneaks up behind me and I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him. But whatever, he's going into battle. He's wound. His adrenaline is high. He is advancing. And he advances and advances, and he just overwhelms the Ammonite army, the king of Ammon. They take 20 towns, and they have victory. And so Jephthah comes back. The Lord has given to them victory. As he's walking up to his home, guess what comes out the door? His only daughter. stuff over here because we don't know. Okay, so take this off the record, but I gotta stay close to this. I don't believe he sacrificed her like that. I think he took her to the tabernacle and offered her as a servant to the tabernacle. Well, that happened. And actually, we're going to look next week at Samuel, who was offered by his mother Hannah. And it says that here that Jephthah did this thing, what he promised. It was Jephthah's decision. He was the guy who made the vow. It was his decision. He had to do it. I believe he took her to the tabernacle, and she served the tabernacle. Because it emphasizes here, a couple of places, it emphasizes that she will never marry. There won't be a wedding. There won't be this big party. There won't be this joyous family. Because she will not be able to marry. And it says that a couple of times in this passage. The other thing, I really don't think he sacrificed her. And it's because this would be like the pagans. These are the people they're fighting. This is why God said, get these people out of the land. It's because that's what they did. They believed in child sacrifice. God doesn't want that. God didn't want it here. God didn't want it. Still doesn't want it. God does not want that to be even a thought of ours. But these people worship their pagan gods by sacrificing children. I don't believe that the two would mix. I don't think God would accept it. I don't think God wanted that at all. And you'd have to find a priest that would do it, which I think would be really tough. So, if we turn back to Hebrews, we have to ask ourselves, why is Jephthah in here? Why is Jephthah there? Why is he listed among the heroes of faith? How can you take a guy like Jephthah? I mean, he's been rejected. He's from a very questionable relationship. He's basically a thug. You know, he goes out and raid. He was going out and raiding other places, other people. He led a group of people liking. Why would he be listed here? How could God use someone like this? And if you Google his name, by the way, you get a massive amount of negative. People love to hate Jephthah, especially people who aren't believers. How could God, why wouldn't he stop this? Why would God allow Jephthah to do anything like this? No matter what happened, how could he do that? We've looked at person after person after person who had sin in their lives, who doubted, who feared, who run ahead, who barely walked the law that they were supposed to walk, like Samson. Barely, I mean, just barely. They broke almost every rule that he had to follow. There are no perfect people. There's no perfect people. So why is he listed? Because of his heart. Because in his heart he wanted to serve God. Because in his heart he wanted to take the next step. By faith, he wanted to see God reward his people. Remember what faith is? Faith is believing that God exists, that he is, and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. I believe Jephthah knew that God wanted to bless his people. But even more than that, we've been studying in the book of Hebrews where this world, we may have some successes, we may have some blessings, we may see God work in our lives, we have direction, we have, sometimes we have some very real encounters with God, and we just are so overwhelmed by that. This is not our reward. Our reward, our salvation guarantees a reward. Our salvation guarantees something much greater than this world. Something that thieves can't take away. Something that can't break down. Something that can't rust. Something that can't deteriorate and collapse. We have that promise from God. We have that salvation that guarantees that. It's not that we're perfect. So the question might better be, can God use me? Can God use me? I'm not perfect. I have weaknesses. I have failures. I've proved it over and over. But can He use me? Do I believe that God can do a work in my life and through my life to further His purpose? I gotta tell you something. We don't stand a chance of doing worse than these guys. There's some professional rebellers here. There's some people in this passage that were just, wow, we're amateurs in here. God can use you. God wants to use you. God desires to use you. But you have to surrender to Him. He said, okay, God, I trust you. I'm going to take the next step. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word today. And I just pray that you would take these words and challenge us to turn to you. To challenge us to take that next step and trust in you with that next thing in our life. Lord, thank you. Thank you for the reminders that you have secured for us a future. It's through your precious Son. It's through that sacrifice